So picture this. It is September of 2013,
Okay.
and a man named Oscar Jackson passes away in South Dakota. He was 102 years old.
Wow, 102.
Right. But his obituary had this really, really specific, tragic detail in it. He had spent the last 42 years waiting to find out who murdered his teenage daughter.
Oh, man. That is just heartbreaking.
It really is. And the craziest part is he died completely unaware that the truth was, well, it was never actually a murder.
Wow.
Yeah. The answer he spent half his life searching for was quietly resting at the bottom of a creek just a few miles away. The 1971 South Dakota mystery.
Right. This is a legendary cold case, and it perfectly illustrates what happens when physical evidence just vanishes. So the date is May 29, 1971.
Okay.
Two 17-year-old girls, Cheryl Miller
Great.
and Pamela Jackson, are driving a 1960 Studebaker Lark to an end-of-the-year high school party in Vermilion, South Dakota.
And the sources have this one eerie detail from a classmate, Mark Lochterman. He was in a car ahead of them with some other boys, and they missed a turn on this dark gravel road. So they stopped at the bottom of a hill to turn around, and when they looked back up the road, the girls' headlights had just vanished, like
Wow.
completely blinked out of existence.
Just gone. And because there was absolutely no physical trace left behind, the town's collective imagination took over. For over 4 decades, people constructed alternative realities.
Yeah, like another classmate, Dwight Iverson, he noted in the AP archives that early on, a lot of people assumed the girls had just run off to a hippie commune.
Right. Or maybe they drove that Studebaker out to California to start a new life.
Wait, but Iverson also insisted they were, quote, good old farm girls. They were very church-oriented, very close to their families. People don't just abandon their entire lives on a random Tuesday without packing a single bag, right?
Precisely. And when that runaway theory inevitably fades because, no letters or phone calls ever arise, the darker theories take root.
Yeah, they always do.
So by 2004, the South Dakota Cold Case Unit actually reopened the investigation, acting almost entirely on the assumption of foul play. They even excavated a local farm.
Because a prison informant came forward, right?
Exactly. This snitch came forward with a supposed confession, which led authorities to zero in on a man named David Lycan.
Who, by the way, was already in prison serving a 227-year sentence for unrelated crimes. They literally indicted this guy on 6 counts of murder for the girl's disappearance.
They did.
Yeah.
The authorities were so desperate for a villain that they completely bought into a jailhouse fabrication. Prosecutors eventually had to drop all the charges when they realized the informant had entirely made up the story.
Wow.
The monster they thought they were hunting was essentially a ghost created by an inmate looking for a reduced sentence.
Which brings us all the way to 2013. We have this severe drought in the area. The water level in Brule Creek drops dramatically, and a local fisherman is walking the embankment, and he spots a rusted wheel sticking out of the mud. It is the 1960 Studebaker Lark. But hold on, I need to stop you here.
Sure.
You were telling me a 1960 car sat in a creek for over 4 decades and didn't just completely rust into a pile of metallic dust? How does the water not destroy everything inside?
It is highly counterintuitive, I know. You would assume water equals total destruction. But the deep, cold water and that thick mud at the bottom of Brule Creek actually created an anaerobic environment.
Anaerobic meaning what? No oxygen.
Exactly. A complete lack of oxygen. The specific bacteria that usually break down organic matter and accelerate severe oxidation simply couldn't survive down there. The mud essentially acted as a sealant.
Oh, wow. So the creek itself preserved the evidence.
Exactly. And that mechanical evidence completely rewrote the 42-year-old murder narrative. When they pulled the car from the creek, they looked at the transmission.
Okay.
And the car was found to be locked in 3rd gear. Now, in a classic 1960s manual transmission, 3rd gear is your high gear, your cruising gear.
Meaning she hadn't downshifted, she wasn't braking or slowly navigating a turn or anything.
Right. If someone had murdered the girls and slowly, deliberately pushed the car into the creek to hide the bodies, the car would be in neutral, or maybe 1st gear.
Oh, that makes sense.
Being locked in 3rd gear mechanically proves this was a high-speed traffic accident. The driver simply lost control on the gravel road, overcorrected, and plunged off the embankment into the flooded creek.
That is just awful.
It is. The cold, dark water perfectly preserved their clothing, their purses, and even Cheryl's driver's license. You could still see her smiling photo.
It is just devastating, and it circles back to that heartbreaking detail about Pamela's father, Oscar. dying at 102 just 5 days before the drought revealed the car. 5 days!
I know.
We spent 42 years chasing runaway theories and elaborate murder plots involving prison inmates, when the tragic truth was a car accident hidden just beneath the surface of a local creek.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reason the 1971 South Dakota case made national news is because of that massive 42-year gap. But we have to realize that this specific tragedy is just a microscopic fraction of a staggering nationwide issue.
Right, because while it's easy to focus on one vintage Studebaker, the reality is that the scale of missing persons in America is almost unfathomable. The NEMU's presentation slides put this into terrifying perspective.
They really do.
On any given day in the United States, how many people are we actively looking for?
Between 80,000 to 90,000 active missing person cases. And almost half of those are classified as cold cases, meaning the date of last contact was over a year ago.
80 to 90,000, that is the entire population of a small city just missing, walking off the map.
And you have to put that missing population next to the other side of the ledger. Medical examiners, coroners, and law enforcement agencies across the country currently hold the remains of approximately 40,000 unidentified decedents.
Okay, so you have thousands of missing people on one side and thousands of unidentified bodies on the other. It is like having thousands of locks on the East Coast and thousands of keys on the West Coast.
That is a great way to look at it.
And NAMUs is basically the locksmith trying to match them up, because before NAMUs, there wasn't a universal system connecting them. Imagine a massive national library where every single state uses a completely different Dewey Decimal System.
Right, complete chaos.
None of the librarians are allowed to talk to each other, and half the index cards are missing. NAMUs was finally introduced as the universal translator to connect these local agencies.
Yes, and they bridge that gap using the UNT Health Science Center, which provides free forensic analysis to families and agencies. They utilize STR, YSTR, and mitochondrial DNA analysis.
Now, I've seen those acronyms thrown around in true crime docs, but what do they actually mean in practice? Like, why use mitochondrial DNA on a 40-year-old bone?
It really comes down to cellular durability. Standard nuclear DNA, the kind we usually think about for identification, degrades relatively quickly when exposed to the elements, especially water.
Okay.
But mitochondrial DNA is like a microscopic time capsule. It is housed outside the cell nucleus in the mitochondria, and there are hundreds of copies per cell instead of just 2.
Oh, I see.
Plus, it's passed down exclusively from mothers to their children. Because it's so abundant and robust, it can survive in bone marrow submerged in a creek for 42 years. That is the exact science they used to positively identify Cheryl and Pamela.
But if the problem is this massive, a literal small city of missing people, and the science is this powerful, why on earth did it take until the late 2000s for a centralized federal database like NAMUS to even exist?
Well, that is a massive institutional failure. For decades, the true extent of the unidentified decedent problem wasn't even known by the federal government.
Seriously?
Yeah. There were massive gaps in jurisdictional record retention. A local county coroner might keep a physical file in a cabinet, while a neighboring county might have no policy for retaining records on unidentified remains at all.
That is insane.
Many of those remains were buried in potter's fields or cremated before any DNA could be extracted or cataloged. It wasn't until a Bureau of Justice Statistics report in the mid-2000s finally exposed this massive black hole of data that the Department of Justice actually funded NAMUS.
But wait. Building federal databases and waiting for mitochondrial DNA analysis takes years, sometimes decades. And human brains absolutely cannot handle that waiting period.
No, we really can't.
When we are denied scientific closure, human nature immediately starts drafting a screenplay. And that is exactly what happened in the cases compiled by the true crime Reddit thread in our sources, where the public was absolutely convinced a murderer was on the loose when the truth was entirely environmental.
The Reddit thread highlights what forensic investigators call the tragedy of misadventure. When someone disappears from a seemingly safe environment, we immediately imagine a sinister kidnapping.
Right.
We rarely stop to consider the mundane, physical traps of our own modern architecture.
Like Tanya Ryder, she goes missing, and law enforcement almost immediately suspects her husband of murder, largely based on a misinterpreted tip from her work supervisor. They spent days grilling him. And where was she? Trapped inside her own crashed car, pinned deep in a ravine, fighting for her life for over a week before she was finally found. Or Marisa Weber. This one is terrifying. She comes home, greets her mother, and then just vanishes from the house. Her family is absolutely terrified she was abducted by a stranger.
Understandably so.
2 weeks later, she is found dead in her own bedroom. She had somehow fallen and become wedged tightly behind a heavy bookshelf.
It defies our sense of spatial logic. It
Right.
sounds completely absurd.
It really does.
But look around the room you're listening in right now. We walk past heavy furniture, tight crawl spaces, and basement utility closets every single day. We completely underestimate how easily the architecture of our own homes can become an inescapable physical trap if we just slip at the wrong angle.
Oh, absolutely.
And the sources detail an even more extreme case of this in Iowa. A supermarket employee had been missing for 10 years.
Yeah.
People thought he ran away, or maybe he was the victim of a local killer.
10 years.
Yeah. A decade later, contractors are removing the store's massive industrial freezers, and they find his mummified body trapped behind them.
Oh my gosh.
He had a history of mental health issues and used to climb on top of the freezers to hide and decompress. He slipped into an 18-inch gap behind them, became wedged, and just couldn't get out.
But wait, how does a body stay behind a grocery store freezer for 10 years without anyone smelling it? People are shopping mere feet away.
It comes down to the mechanics of industrial refrigeration.
Yeah.
Those massive freezers have huge exhaust fans pumping out heat.
Okay.
Those fans blow a constant high-velocity stream of hot, dry air directly into the space behind the units. It basically acted like a giant industrial dehydrator.
Wow, so it dried everything out.
Exactly. It rapidly halted the normal bacterial decomposition process, mummifying the remains before any noticeable odor could develop, and the loud hum of the compressor motors completely drowned out his calls for help.
That is absolute nightmare fuel. I mean, really.
Yeah.
But it's not just physical traps either. What about Daniel O'Keefe from Australia? He was missing for 5 years. And his case is wild because there were sightings of him reported all over the world. People swore they saw him. But he was ultimately found by his own father, who is just doing routine maintenance under their family home. Daniel's remains were deep inside a limestone wall cavity right beneath their feet the entire time.
What's fascinating here is what Daniel O'Keefe's case reveals about human psychology, specifically regarding eyewitness testimony. In almost every high-profile disappearance, people come forward completely convinced they saw the missing person.
Right.
But eyewitness memory is notoriously flawed. Someone sees a man with a similar haircut, and their brain, wanting to be helpful or wanting to be part of the unfolding drama, retroactively creates a false memory. It is an unconscious psychological projection filling in the blank spaces.
And the public projection gets even wilder when the disappearance is actually voluntary. The sources bring up Brenda Heist, missing for 11 years. The police launched this massive homicide investigation, focusing heavily on her husband. She is literally legally declared dead by a judge. Then, one day, she just walks into a police station in Florida. She admits she was overwhelmed by financial stress, her marriage was failing, and she literally just walked off with some unhoused people she met while crying on a park bench.
The public's desire for a villain is so strong that we even have cases like Natasha Ryan in Australia. She goes missing at 14 during a period when a local serial killer is active.
Oh, wow.
The killer actually confesses and takes credit for her murder. But during his trial, authorities get an anonymous tip. Natasha was alive.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she had run away and been secretly hiding in her boyfriend's house across town for years. We are so drawn to the elaborate cinematic narrative of a cunning serial killer that we completely overlook a teenager sneaking out to live with her boyfriend.
Okay, I am going to push back here. Because as comforting as it might be to rationalize that most disappearances are just tragic freak accidents involving bookshelves or someone needing a desperate break from their life, that's not always the truth.
That is fair.
Sometimes the sinister theories are dead on. Sometimes the spouse really did do it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the Cheryl Miller case.
Ah, yes. The Cheryl Miller saga. This case is the dark flip side to the tragedy of misadventure. It is a prime example of genuine, calculated malice, and it introduces a radically new element to our discussion, the digital trail.
Right. So, November 1999, Bruce Miller is found shot to death at his junkyard business in Mount Morris, Michigan. It looks like a standard, maybe robbery gone wrong homicide at first glance. But the investigation slowly reveals that his wife, Cheryl Miller, had been carrying on an intense online affair with a former police officer named Jerry Cassidy. And together, over internet chat rooms and emails, they meticulously plotted Bruce's murder.
Cassidy was the triggerman who drove to Michigan, but Cheryl was the architect who manipulated him into doing it. What turns this into a fascinating legal roller coaster, however, is the evidence. Shortly after the murder, Jerry Cassaday died by suicide. But before he died, he printed out all their emails and left a detailed suicide note confessing to the murder and explicitly outlining Sherry's involvement.
Wow.
So in 2000, Sherry was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life, heavily based on that suicide note.
Case closed, right? Absolutely not. 8 years later, in 2008, a federal judge steps in and throws out her conviction. The judge ruled that Cassaday's suicide note never should have been shown to the jury in the first place.
Right?
But why? I mean, if a guy writes, "We did it right before he dies," isn't that the ultimate proof?
Not in the eyes of the United States Constitution. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a defendant the right to confront and cross-examine their accuser. Because Cassaday was dead, Sherry's defense attorneys could not put him on the stand.
Oh, I see.
They couldn't ask him if he was lying or if he was just a bitter ex-lover trying to frame her out of spite. That is technically considered hearsay.
But wait, isn't there an exception in the law for dying declarations? Like, if you are critically wounded on the street and point at the person who attacked you, they can use that in court, right?
Yeah, yes. The dying declaration exception exists because the legal theory assumes someone who knows they're about to die won't lie. But a suicide note is incredibly tricky territory.
Oh, because they're choosing to die.
Exactly. Is it a genuine dying declaration of a guilty conscience, or is it a calculated final act of revenge by someone who controls the exact narrative of their own death? The federal judge in 2008 decided it was a violation of her rights throughout the conviction, and Cheryl Miller was released on bond pending a new trial.
And this is where the timeline gets a very bizarre, modern twist. While she is out on bond, awaiting retrial for plotting a murder over the internet, she starts posting on Facebook.
Which, as you can imagine, caused an absolute media firestorm.
Total public uproar. People were furious. Her lawyer defended it, saying, look, her conviction was overturned. She is legally presumed innocent right now. She hasn't violated any terms of her bond. And she's just using Facebook to communicate with her son, who is deployed overseas in the military.
Right.
Which, strictly speaking from a legal standpoint, was true. She had the right. But the prosecutor pointed out the sheer audacity of someone using social media while out on bail for an internet-facilitated murder.
This raises an important question about how digital evidence completely disrupted the traditional justice system. Chat rooms, Facebook messages, printed emails, digital suicide notes. These were all relatively new frontiers in law in the late 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, totally unprecedented.
They leave a permanent footprint, but integrating them into the strict, centuries-old rules of courtroom evidence is incredibly complex.
But eventually, that digital footprint caught up with her. In 2012, higher appellate courts reviewed the case and ruled that the suicide note, combined with the sheer volume of corroborating emails and digital evidence, was actually trustworthy enough to be admitted. Her convictions were reinstated and she went back to prison. And then, the final twist. In 2016, Cheryl Miller sent a 4-page typed letter to the judge, flat out admitting her guilt and her role in her husband's death. She finally confessed to all of it.
It is a stark reminder. While we shouldn't always jump to the immediate conclusion of foul play when someone vanishes, human malice is very real. And in the modern age, malice almost always leaves a trail of data.
So what does this all mean? We've been on a massive journey today through the sources. We went from the rusted chassis of a 1960s Studebaker, perfectly preserved in an oxygen-starved South Dakota creek for over 40 years.
Yeah.
We looked at the massive nationwide databases at NAMUS, relying on the microscopic time capsules of mitochondrial DNA to match tens of thousands of missing people with unidentified remains. We explored the bizarre, tragic reality of misadventure people mummified behind grocery store freezers or trapped behind bookshelves while the world assumes they were murdered. And we've seen how a deadly internet plot can test the absolute limits of the Sixth Amendment.
If there is a key takeaway from all of these sources today, I think it is the absolute necessity of critical thinking and suspended judgment, especially when you consume true crime media.
Absolutely.
We have a profound natural bias toward narrative. We want the dramatic villain. But the simplest explanation is a missed turn on a dark gravel road, a slip in a quiet house, a tragic environmental trap is very often the truth. We have to resist the urge to write our own endings and let the science and the evidence lead the way.
And learning about this really forces you to look at the world around you a little differently. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Think about the physical spaces you occupy every single day. The heavy walls of your house, the creek you drive over on your way to work, the digital servers silently holding your private messages.